Welcome everyone. My name's Ben Foley. I'd like to welcome you to this event this evening. We'll be discussing Palestine's struggle and Britain's deadly role, Balfour Empire, the Mandate and Resistance. Today's forum is organised by Arise, a festival of left ideas, Britain's biggest left events platform online, and it's increasingly organising in person as well. Although called some months ago, this is now a particularly timely discussion in light of the latest Israeli government aggressions and atrocities we've seen against the Palestinian people in recent days and in recent months, but particularly with the deliberate starving of Gaza whilst this latest military action continues. For many of us in solidarity, active in solidarity with the Palestinian people over the years and the decades, it's further confirmation of our need to stand firmly in solidarity with the Palestinian people and call out the backing of our UK government, the US and others for Israel's illegal occupation and abuses of human rights, including through arms sales. Today we're looking at Britain's role in Palestine's struggle and the emergence of Israel and the Israeli state, a role that has evolved over the past century and is a role which the US has taken over from in many senses from Britain. For me, we all have a personal link or a kind of a moment in which we got involved in this campaigning. For me, I heard stories of my own grandfather's military service with the British Army in Palestine in the 1940s and the experience of the militant actions of those seeking to establish an Israeli state. And after that, and perhaps revealing my age, but that I'm not the longest serving solidarity activist, but I was only a few weeks at university when the Second Intifada began in 2000, and then it was the events of that period and particularly events like the Israeli assault on the Jenin refugee camp in 2002 that kind of engaged me particularly, and I've been an active member of PSC personally ever since then for the past 20 or so years. But to discuss the title that we have today, in Britain's deadly role, we're joined by Bernard Regan, a long-time campaigner for and a writer on Palestinian rights. He's a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Executive Committee, an author of the Balfour Declaration, Empire, Mandate and Resistance in Palestine, which is a central reading and will be the backdrop to his contribution today. He was the first recipient of the NUT's Steve Sinnott Award in recognition of his contribution to international solidarity. And we'd like to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible following Bernard's contribution. Because of the size of the audience today, with hundreds of you joining in, I can see it ticking up now. It's still going up. We've got volunteers who are going to be facilitating your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. So please post both your comments for discussion and your questions to the speakers in the Q&A function. We'll have some time for a number of rounds of questions from the audience once Bernard's done his initial contribution. And if you can, please also donate a link which will pop up to help with the cost of the event. But now I'd like to hand over to Bernard Regan. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you very much to Arise for this kind invitation. You referred to how you became involved in Palestine, and I just, if I may, say something about my background to involvement, because it's an interesting story in a way, and that is that back in 1967, 68, 69, I happened to be, at that time, a member of an organization which was called the International Socialist, later became Socialist Workers' Party, but I left that. But the interesting thing was that we used to meet in the front room of a house of a man called Igel Gluckstein, who many people on the left might know better as Tony Cliff. And he was himself a Palestinian Jewish anti-Zionist activist who left Palestine and came to London. In actual fact, he was forbidden, I think, by the then Labour government from entering Britain in the late 1940s, and actually went to live in Ireland. He spent some time in Dublin. And we used to meet in the front room of his house in Stoke Newington in London. And we used to have people invited to come along and talk about a whole variety of topics, about Vietnam, about South Africa and so on. And one of the first people that I met there in 1969, I think it was Moshe Makova, who some of you will have heard. Moshe, too, is an anti-Zionist um, socialist political activist, and along with Nicola Jabra, who was a Palestinian, and they had had been involved jointly in an organization inside historic Palestine, and campaigning against Zionism. So that was kind of one of the first occasions of encountering somebody talking about Palestine. And the interesting thing that really struck me at the time was that here were Jewish socialists who were critical of Israel, because for a long time, and this is one of the things that is worth reflecting on, particularly on the left and in the Labour Party, Israel was seen as a kind of haven of progressive views, and the whole model that was presented was that it was a neo-socialist society with the creation of kibbutz, which were really kibbutzim, which were really kind of communist kind of paradigms. They were places where people shared their tasks, that they worked equally, that men and women were treated equally, and that the society was one which was very kind of collective. And that was the story that was presented. So to hear socialists, revolutionaries, communists talking about Israel in a critical way was actually kind of an eye-opener, and something that really kind of made me reflect on what attitude one should have towards Palestine and the Palestinians. And then later again, particularly around the time of the first war against Lebanon in 1981-82, one of the events that happened, which was world noticed event, was the massacre that took place in two Palestinian refugee camps, the camps of Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. And that happened because the Palestine Liberation Organization at the time formed an agreement to leave with their arms, and went mainly to Tunisia, and left behind women, children, and older men who were non-combatants in these refugee camps. And more than 1,400, 1,500, figures vary, of them were slaughtered actually slaughtered by the Christian phalangists. As you might guess, the name phalange taken directly from the Spanish fascists. And that slaughter, which was carried out under the protection of the Israeli Defense Forces, who formed a cordon outside of the two refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, whilst these horrendous massacres were going on. And the interesting thing about that is that became a worldwide cause in terms of kind of the gravity of what has happened. And I began with other comrades who were working on the National Union of Teachers at the time, taking up that issue and calling for an international inquiry in a similar way to we now see bodies like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court looking at events that are taking place in Gaza and in the West Bank and in occupied Palestine. So that initiative, if you like, that we took up was around the issue of the way in which the massacres had taken place. And just to kind of complete that bit of the narrative, there were actually, in response to those events, mass demonstrations inside Israel, with up to, I think it was 500,000 on the streets protesting at what had happened, the barbarity of what had happened. And the Minister of Defense was Ariel Sharon, and an Israeli Court of Appeal under a Judge Kahan came to the conclusion that he had acted improperly, and he was dismissed from his post. Subsequently, he went on to be Prime Minister many years later. But that was there was, if you like, let's say, an ethics to some extent. The attack that took place at Sabra and Shatila was really absolutely horrendous, and it's detailed in the books by Avi Schleim, The Iron Wall, and it's referenced in other history books, obviously Rashid Halidi and other other historians have written about it, but it was an absolutely horrendous and barbaric attack. And clearly, you will be making the connection in your own minds, quite rightly, with the kind of barbarity that we're now seeing taking place in Gaza, absolutely horrendous. So those were the formative things that kind of compelled me to become interested in Palestine. And at the same time, in the 1990s, we saw the discussions that were taking place between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which allegedly were going to lead to some kind of solution, some kind of agreement about the formation of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. And you know the whole story, but the area that was occupied by the Israelis up to 1967 was part of the state of Israel, or to become part of the state of Israel, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza to become part of a Palestinian state. But it was carved up into whole sections, into areas A, B, and C in the West Bank. And the Israelis, authorities, and so on, had no real intention of allowing that process to develop, because it was meant to conclude within a matter of 4 or 5 years with the creation of that Palestinian state. And I went to Palestine first, just after that in 1996, 97, and saw what was happening, the checkpoints, the brutality of the way in which the military forces at that time were treating the Palestinians. We saw the clear beginnings of segregation and a kind of vicious, repressive attitude towards the Palestinians. And we went to refugee camps, we went and visited schools and so on and so forth. So that was part of my history, if you like, of how I came to be involved in Palestine. And then later, I was involved in campaigning on Palestine with a number of other comrades who essentially, to put it blunt, rebuilt the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, because there had been this kind of general sentiment that, okay, now that Oslo has happened, now that there's some kind of agreement, the prospect is that there will be a Palestinian state. And those people at the time, some of them, not all of them, some of them thought, well, there's no need for a solidarity organization. So the solidarity organization really dwindles. And at the beginning of the 2000s, I think we had an AGM with about perhaps 20 or 30 people there, but decided that it was absolutely vital to rebuild a solidarity movement in Britain, and that solidarity movement should be built on trying to win a mass audience, to engage with people on a wide political basis of recognition of the rights of the Palestinians to self-determination, the right for statehood, and so on and so forth. And that campaign also particularly paid attention to the trade unions and winning the trade unions, reflecting on the model of the anti-apartheid movement and how that had been built and how that had engaged with the trade unions and so on. So in the course of engagement with this and meeting and talking to many Palestinians, I particularly became interested in what was the role of the British? How had the British reacted? What were their responsibilities, and what exactly had they done? And my view was that in general, the kind of reportage that you got, that we saw in terms of popular kind of presentation, was that this was a fight between Jews and Muslims. The kind of national perspective of the Palestinian ambitions was completely marginalized and not recognized. The whole issue was treated in terms of a very crude binary oppositions between terrorists on the one hand and these democratic government of Israel on the other. And that this clearly was something that I had witnessed already by going to Palestine, was something that was a travesty of the truth. But also it seemed to me that what wasn't really explored, or at least at the time I wasn't kind of able to find access to, was something that really spelt out what role had the British played? How had they come to be involved? What had they been aiming to do? Was it entirely a kind of well-intentioned attempt to rescue Jews from the horrendous anti-Semitism that was taking place in Europe? Or what was its attitude towards the Palestinian people and the people of the region? And so I wanted to explore this, and I sort of took on studying and doing a PhD, but I wanted particularly to work with Palestinian historians because I don't speak Arabic and I don't read or write Arabic, unfortunately. So I wanted very much to be kind of guided by a Palestinian perspective, at least to have Palestinians who were looking critically at what I was writing, so that I ensured that it did really kind of acknowledge, the whole perspective that the Palestinians had on what was taking place. So that was how I came to write the book, and Verso were kind enough to publish it. And that was really kind of, what I undertook. And I undertook it because I thought, in part, there was a tendency, as I said, to have this kind of binary story, a binary kind of narrative, that on the one hand and on the other hand, and that it was simply a matter of a dispute, however grave, a dispute, a fight, a conflict between, on the one hand, Jewish citizens and Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs. And this seems to me to be wholly inadequate and didn't tell the whole story. So that was how I got into writing the book. And I particularly wanted to look at Britain's responsibility and the role that Britain played, and to explore, was it, even leaving for a moment, the kind of discussion about Zionism, which we can come on to, was it an altruistic gesture towards Jews who were being persecuted, or was there some perspective that the British had of their own that they were seeking to advance? And looking at it, and really going in to examine it, what was very clear is that the moment in which this was taking place and the whole context really has to be understood in terms of the development of imperialism, how imperialism was evolving at the end of the 19th century and through into the 20th century. And some of you will be familiar with these images I'm going to show up, but I've just hopefully I'll be able to share these with you and put up some images illustrating just exactly the scale of British imperialism's influence across the globe, and how that came to be significant in terms of looking at what happened to the Palestinians. So let me try and see if I can do this sharing, and if you'll be patient with me, hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, that's worked for me, Bernard. You might want to maximize your screen, but yeah, it looks fine.
I'm not sure what you can see on there, but
You can see the main panel and your now it's just a single big panel. So
okay.
it's as you planned, I think.
So I think this kind of illustrates very graphically the kind of world in which the issue of Palestine began to be discussed and became an issue. The Berlin Conference of 84 to 85 was essentially European countries carving up Africa to seek places of influence. And of course, that legacy remains through to today. If you look at the situation in countries like the West African countries, the Francophone countries of Mali, Senegal, Niger, and so on, and also the countries of Northern Africa, became subjected to French imperialism. Congo dominated by Belgium. Germany had colonies in Africa, in Southwest Africa, and in what was called Tanganyika, became Tanzania later. And other countries had an interest too. And just interestingly, looking at that, you can see that the United States of America participated in the Berlin Conference. It's interesting because there is often this kind of myth that America was not an imperialist country, but it had an interest, and it was there and it was present at the time. And this is how the conference decided to divide up Africa. You can see the two maps, one prior to the conference and its decisions, and the second one reflecting in 1913 just exactly how that division had taken place and what it looked like. The pink section of Africa, right from the north, from Egypt through down to South Africa, was the British, and you can see the other pink areas, which of course are modern day Nigeria, Ghana, and so on. And the blue area, the Francophone countries, Algeria, Morocco, Mali, Senegal, and so on. And the purple one in the middle, the Belgian Congo. So that was how the world was divided up by the imperialists, the spheres of influence that they looked at. In addition, there were other empires, but not with the same capacity in terms of their economic, political, or military strength. The Ottoman Empire had declined quite considerably by 1914. But the interesting thing looking at this map is that you can see the extent goes beyond modern day Turkey, goes through into Syria, Iraq, or what they then called Mesopotamia, through Jordan, Palestine, and down the eastern coast of the Red Sea. And you can see that it extends right to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula down to Aden and to Yemen and that area. And why that is significant is because the British, of course, empire extended to India, and India was an absolutely vital and critical part of the British Empire in terms of the exploitation that was carried on by the British. And actually to bring goods back to Britain, that whole seaway of the Red Sea from the tip of Aden right up to, you can see on the map, Cairo there, or the Suez Canal, was a vital waterway. And at this time, Britain had something like more than half of the world's merchant shipping was sailing under a British flag. And you can see on this map, the British Empire in 1914, you can see why they had a concern about the Red Sea, because were the Ottoman Empire to try to close it off, then that would absolutely massively disrupt British sailing and so on, and British navigation. So that whole area was a vital interest. And this is how the map looked after the end of that First World War. So you can see the incredible scale of the British Empire, the largest empire that there has ever been in terms of its land mass, in terms of its population. And Britain's interest was that it was able to have that waterway of the Suez Canal free to them to actually ensure that the transportation could continue, and the British merchant fleet would be able to sail through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean and so on. One of the German newspapers writing at the time said that the British wanted to turn the Indian Ocean into a British lake. They were quite conscious of the significance of what was going on and what the British ambitions were. Now, the British, of course, entered into negotiations before the First World War, or in the very early years of it, with the Arab peoples of the region. And they wanted them to align with the British and become allies against the German Ottoman axis that was fighting in the First World War. And so in the process of those negotiations, they signed an agreement, or in an exchange of letters indicated agreement and support, that in return for the Arab peoples supporting the British against the Ottoman Empire and against that Ottoman German alliance, the area that is shown on this map with the dark boundary surrounding it would become independent and have the right to self-determination. And this formula, this map that you can see, was written out quite explicitly by the Arab peoples on the basis of what was called the Damascus Protocol, an agreement that had been arrived at by nationalist independent political forces who had met in Damascus and formulated this as a way of expressing the area that they believe should become independent, not only from the Ottoman Empire, but self-governing countries. And the British acquiesced to that. Now, since that time, since that discussion was taking place, the British denied it and repudiated it and said, no, we made no such commitment. We excluded Jerusalem from this. We excluded the area of Palestine because we have given an undertaking that there will be a homeland for the Jews in that area. And the British, as ever, completely duplicitous, not satisfied with just having negotiations with the Arab peoples, entered into discussions with the French, and this was the way in which they decided that they would divide it up. And they were having these negotiations quite separately from the two groups and entering into commitments in respect of that. Now, at the same time, they were also discussing with a third group of people, and that was Zionist Federation, the Zionist organization, looking at how there would be the creation of a homeland for the Jews in the area. And those negotiations came about because of the emergence of Zionism. And Zionism was really very much at the end of the 19th century, a political philosophy, political attitude, seeking to create a homeland for the Jews that would be on historic Palestine. And the British made a commitment to that. But my point about all of this is that essentially the British were acting out of their own interests. And indeed, even amongst the Jewish community, there were people who were vigorously opposed to the proposal for the creation of a Jewish homeland. One of the most notable is a man called Sir Edwin Montagu, who was Secretary of State for India. And India was, to have that position of Secretary of State for India was a real prominent member of the British cabinet. And they were opposed to it. Zionism was by no means a majority view within the Jewish community, Jews universally. It was actually a minority position. And there's an interesting book called Revolutionary Yiddishland, which will tell you all about the different political currents within Jewish society in Eastern Europe in particular. People who were communists, Jews who were members of the Bund, which was kind of a social democratic party, and other political forces, and those and religious Zionists who were also opposed to the creation of a Jewish state because they believed that only God could grant the right for Jews to have a state and so on. So these were some of the groups of people. One of the things to introduce early into the discussion is the people who were formulating the idea of a Jewish homeland and putting it forward. And this is the cabinet. Now, normally, if we were having this discussion in person, I'd have a quiz and see how many of these people you can name. But I'm going to put you out of your misery and just put the names up so that you can see them. But the interesting thing about this group of people is you can see on it, apart from Balfour, who was the author, and Lloyd George, who was a virulent supporter, and so was Curzon. Milner at the bottom was not an uncritical supporter of the idea of a Jewish homeland. But next to him, George Barnes, representing the Labour Party, because this is a coalition government. So the Labour Party, even before the Balfour Declaration is actually written and signed, were supportive of the notion of a Jewish homeland. So, there has been a long tradition within the Labour Party of that sort of view. And interestingly, the cabinet at that time was made up of people who were supporting Britain in the war effort. And Jan Smuts was the Prime Minister of South Africa. And of course, Smuts went on to become essentially the godfather of apartheid and the apartheid regime. And next to him, Edward Carson, who was completely opposed to Irish independence and Irish home rule. And of course, as I always say at this point, the man who prosecuted the great Oscar Wilde and, was not a very pleasant character whatsoever. These were the people who came together and formulated the Balfour Declaration, a declaration which, when you have opportunity to read it, you can see doesn't even mention the Palestinian people. It talks about a homeland for the Jews. it talks about the non-Jewish communities as though they were just that. They didn't have an identity. They didn't have, they weren't an entity themselves. And what it talks about is the civil and religious rights of these people. It doesn't talk about the political rights. In other words, from the outset, it's denying or marginalized the concept of self-determination for the Palestinians. And I say that not as someone looking back historically and saying, look, I'm doing an analysis of this wording and this is what this means. This was said by the Palestinians at the League of Nations in the early 1920s when they went to make representation for the establishment of a Palestinian nation. And they were quite explicit. They say what the Balfour Declaration means is it's denying us our political rights, and it's not entitling us to go ahead and create a Palestinian state. So they were extremely clear in understanding what was the venture that was conducted. And going back to this issue of how the British kind of prioritized it, it was about British interests. And this is not, again, reading back into history something and saying, I can pick that bit of text and that bit of quotation, and this gives you the answers. People like Lord Kitchener, who was, some of you will remember the famous poster from the war effort of the First World War with his face and pointing a finger saying, your country needs you. He wrote a document called Alexandretta to Mesopotamia, in which he explicitly said there are three concerns that we have. One is the Suez Canal, and I've explained that. The second is that we need to ensure we have a land route to India that is across the land bridge from the Eastern Mediterranean of Palestine across to Mesopotamia, because they wanted to have a way of guaranteeing that if they couldn't go through the Suez Canal, that military forces from Britain could get to India as quickly as possible, because there were uprisings in the northwestern part of India. There were tribal risings against the British. There was also the potential threat of the Russians, the Tsarist Russians, wanting to come into the Indian Ocean area. And Kitchener spelt this out and said, that's the reason. But he added another thing, which is not often commented on, but I think was important. And that was, he talked about having control over oil. Because in 1912, oil began to be an issue for the British. They wanted to be independent of America, who had been the suppliers for some time, and they wanted to have access and control over their own resources. And particularly, this was Persia. So you had the Anglo-Persian oil company, which became BP and so on, was kind of one of the things. And the cabinet saw these things, these material areas of interest, as being critical to the reasons why they wanted to, or they were supportive of the idea of a Palestinian a homeland for the Jews in the land of Palestine. And Balfour, as you can see here, was utterly racist towards the Palestinians and dismissive of their ambitions. Zionism and the way in which Zionism developed, we can perhaps discuss that in a moment. But the point was that the Zionists did have a very clear perspective of what they wanted to achieve in economic terms, in social terms, in political terms, and even in military terms. So the Yishuv, as it was called, the Jewish community within historic Palestine, was extremely well organized and was organized autonomously from British mandate political rule that was in there. And some of the critical things that happened was the purchase of land by the Zionists, which was taken initially very largely from absentee landlords, many of whom lived in Lebanon, but also it was in the process of doing that, Palestinians were removed from the land, and many became, workers without anywhere to work, and gravitated towards the cities. And when they got there, those places of employment, which were run by Jewish owners, actually refused to employ them. And this was an attitude of exclusion. It was called Avoda Ivrit, Hebrew labor, which said that Jewish workers would be Palestinian workers would be excluded from any Jewish employer, and that was supported by the organization, which was the trade union organization, the Histadrut at the time. I'm going to make a jump. Ben, how are we for time? You must tell me.
You're getting on for just about half an hour, so I don't know how much more you want to go through, but
Okay,
just
well,
just flagging that.
all right. No, that's fair enough. No, please do tell me. Just very quickly, I just want to assert the point that the Palestinians did have a political perspective. This was the third Congress that took place there, as the name obviously implies. There have been a series of congresses preceding that, and right the way through the 20s, there were congresses which were defining what it should be. And the population, as you can see, even, and I'm going to jump to this, even if you look at the 1930s and the 1940s, the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine, of Christians and Muslims, because they were all Palestinians, was an overwhelming majority from 90% as it had been around the time of the First World War through to 1947. It was still overwhelmingly Palestinian Arab. I'm going to jump just to, I just wanted to make the point there that the Labour Party, again, Ramsay MacDonald's government was consistently pro-Zionist and supporting the rights of the creating of a homeland for the Jews, was there all the time. I'm going to jump to, because I think this is kind of pertinent in terms of coming right up to the moment, what I think was an important watershed in terms of Palestinians' right to self-determination was the defeat that was inflicted on the Palestinians by a combination of the British, principally the British, and Zionist forces in the uprising that took place between 1936 and 1939. And it's not an area that I feel is really kind of analysed and looked at in sufficient depth, because it was a mass uprising. People will notice the coincidence of this dates with the Spanish Civil War. It was, a time of uprising against imperialism that took place in Palestine. And this uprising was begun with a general strike that went on for several months when the whole of Palestine was closed down, and then went on to lead to an armed uprising sustained by national committees. They were called national committees in each of the towns and cities across Palestine, who were giving support to those conducting the fight against the British, a fight which was viciously repressed and in the most horrendous way, in ways, and maybe I'll stop at this point, Ben, in ways which actually are very familiar to people looking at what is happening in Gaza. The terrorizing of people, the conducting of massacres in places like Tantura, Deir Yassin, Safsaf, Lid, Lod, and other Palestinian cities where people were attacked and slaughtered, and a fact that was repeated in 1948 during the Nakba. But this period of 36-39 was really perhaps the most defining moment in terms of Palestinians' right to self-determination and the denial by the British, who deployed a quarter of the British army, the non-Indian British army, a quarter of the British army in that small territory in order to suppress that uprising. And it was of the most vicious kind. And paramilitary organizations like the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Stern Gang of the Zionist organizations were working with the British to conduct this suppression, during which the Palestinian people were completely disarmed. And as a result, when it came to 1948, had very little resources, if any, to respond to the onslaught that took place. I'll stop at that point, Ben, because that, if you like, sets the scene, and we could go on maybe in the questions to look at what happened in 1948 and what happened subsequently, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Just to flag to people watching, you can obviously see, well, you might be able to see there's about 180 or so who are on the Zoom call, but actually we think there's about 300 or so watching at the moment, whether on YouTube or Facebook as well as on the Zoom call. and just to give you an idea of where they're watching from. I mean, there's lots of people from London, people across the south of England, from places like Brighton and Christchurch and Ipswich and East Anglia. There's people in Rhondda Cynon Taf in Wales, across the Midlands. There's people from Northampton, Staffordshire, going up to Crewe and further north to Leeds. But we've also got an international audience. We've got people, certainly we've seen from the US, people from Washington, DC and from Phoenix. So it's a good turnout tonight. We know lots more will be watching it on YouTube afterwards, after it's finished going out live. So it's really educational and really reaching out to people. I'm just going to pause before we go to any questions, and just invite Neve Eiliff, who's a RISE volunteer, who's going to tell us a bit more about the organiser today and how you can help us out going forwards. So Neve.
Hello, thank you very much, Ben. So I'm just one of the volunteers with Arise today, and I just want to flag, as the organisers of the event today, just how important it is that we have these political spaces where we can learn and meet each other in really worrying times for a lot of us around the world. And so I just wanted to flag the event next week, which is the Halt Disability Benefit Cuts Now, online next Tuesday. So if you like this and you like these kind of events, please do come along and be a regular friend of Arise. On that point, if you are in a position to donate to Arise to keep these events running, please do. You can become a friend of Arise and donate £5 a month, or any donations are massively helpful. You can also follow us on our social medias and keep up to date on all sorts of events and educational experiences that are going on all over the place. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Neve. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't yet done so, you can put questions and comments in the Q&A function on Zoom. We've had a number come through already, so I'll start with a sort of small round for Bernard to make a note of and come back on, and then we'll go back to some further questions. Just one, I'm going to start with a question from David Rees. He's just asking, who were the Palestinians that were around the time of the First World War? Were there people who lived there for generations? Did they have a sort of distinct identity, or is the modern Palestinian identity formed from the struggle since? But yeah, sort of taking it back to the start point around when the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot discussions were taking place. If you want to come back on that, or in fact, I'll just start there, and I've got a few more I'm going to read through. So if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, certainly the Palestinians were around back through the 19th century and were involved in struggles against Napoleon, who was trying to take control of the area and was looking to control Egypt and control the Ottoman Empire, which was in decline. And certainly there were challenges, if you like, that took place through that time. But the Palestinian development of national identity took place through the end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. Ironically, the Palestinians had a more democratic society under the Ottomans than they did under the British. They could actually elect people to parliament. They were only men. Of course, that was universal in Britain. There was no female suffrage. They could nominate people. It was always, again, like in Britain, it was on the basis of property. But they were represented in the Ottoman parliament, and there were recorded written records of speeches that were made by representatives from Jerusalem and from other cities, calling for the right for the Palestinians to establish statehood. There was also objection to changes in the Ottoman laws which had taken place. There were two land laws which took place in the 1860s, which enabled people to buy land and change the contractual relationship and tenure that Palestinian farmers and other farmers, indeed, in the Ottoman Empire had, so that instead of being sort of guaranteed in perpetuity the right to live on and work the land where they were, that land became a commodity, and the land became alienated, so people could actually buy stretches of land And so there were actually, initiatives taken, or people from France and Germany who bought territory in the north, some of them in Syria and other parts. And there was an objection to this. There were Palestinian demonstrations I think in the 1880s, 1890s about land being sold off. And it was being sold off at that time, again, by Lebanese landlords who were selling it off to Zionists. Well, not actually to Zionists, strictly speaking, but to Jewish peoples who had moved there, and these were not necessarily political Zionists ambitious to create a state, but who wanted to return to Palestine in a kind of religious sort of context. And certainly going through the 20s, very much there were, as I said, between 1917, 1918, 1919 through to the late 1920s, there were congresses, Palestinian congresses, which formulated the demands of the creation of a state for a democratic assembly. There were the creation of political parties and political organizations, including women's organizations, by the way, who carried out demonstrations and activity to protest against Britain's denial of Palestinian democratic rights. And very much the force of establishing a Palestinian state was there right the way through. I think, just going back on talking about Zionism, which I didn't really kind of develop, was that Zionism itself was a very, very recent thing. It was something that really evolved in the late 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s, and the 1900s. It was not a majority view amongst Jews across Europe, principally, we're talking about. It certainly wasn't something that the Arab Jewish world, the Mizrahi Jews of Syria, of Iraq, of Algeria, and so on, were committed to. They were part of the Arab community. They were a diaspora, but they were part of the Arab communities, many of them speaking Arabic. There's an interesting book by Abi Schleim, who writes about how he was born and grew up in Baghdad. And when he went to Israel, this was after 1948, he was actually kind of bullied by Ashkenazi Jews who regarded him as an Arabic speaker as being, someone to be poo-pooed, to be treated in a disdained way. But certainly, to come back to your question, yes, there was the formulation of a Palestinian perspective, and that was growing, I would argue, through the 19th century. And certainly in terms of cultural and historical kind of continuity, you can trace that back through many thousands of years. The Palestinian historian Noam Masalha has written a book called The 4,000-Year History of Palestine, which traces it back. And Jews were part of that society, but they were not the only, and nor were they the dominant group within that geographical area. So the short answer, yes, there was very much a growing Palestinian consciousness. And I should say, because Arabic was kind of like common across the area, there were exchanges with people seeking national self-determination in places like Syria and in places like Egypt. There were revolts in Egypt against the British and in Syria against the French. So it was very much kind of a notion of independence. And in a way, in a paradoxical way, this had been promoted or had been gained kind of popularity or credence because the president of the United States of America, Woodrow Wilson, talked about the rights of countries to self-determination. It was surrounded by all sorts of caveats about, basically when the imperialists thought that the subjugated people were in an advanced enough state that they could manage their own affairs. So it was bound by all sorts of patronizing and arrogant, imperialistic, not to say racist kind of ideology. But notwithstanding that, the idea of self-determination was something that was very much discussed. And of course, by absolute contrast, the Soviet Union, the young revolutionary Russia in 1917, towards the end of 1917, declared that it absolutely supported the right of self-determination without any qualification, and promulgated this, held a Congress of Toilers of the East, it was called subsequently, where these matters were discussed. And also, they exposed all of the internal documents of the machinations that the British had been engaged in with the French, reaching agreements to, as I showed you on the map, to divide up the area. And they, they handed this material over to the Arab peoples and said, this is what they're doing behind your back. They exposed it. So, yes, the answer is that there was a very much a accelerating process towards national self-determination in Palestine and across the whole of the area.
Okay, thanks. I've got loads more coming in now. I have to sort of rattle through a few and perhaps we need to do some just do some quicker responses. But because there's people are
You're being very polite, Ben.
They're getting warmed up. I mean, perhaps so. Then, just looking at this period, the 20s and 30s, perhaps just a few comments on what was Britain's experience of and relationship with those advocating the establishment of an Israeli state from that period from that either those negotiations with people in the sort of in the period of the First World War and onward to what was the British relationship with people like bodies like the Irgun and the Stern Gang, and perhaps moving on from that, could you say, does Britain bear any kind of responsibility for how Palestinian land as we know it today is being split up between the West Bank and Gaza? And as we're looking at creations of states that hadn't previously existed when they'd all been under the Ottoman Empire. One question from Tebrez is, what role did the British establishment support for the creation of Saudi Arabia cement the establishment of Israel, and how has that led to the behaviour of the modern Saudi state? So perhaps just some quick thoughts on that, and then I've got a load more coming in, so I'll try and formulate some of those.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the British. I mean, I will say this, which might be a bit controversial, but right the way through, I think the British avoided saying what they intended for the area. They talked about a homeland for the Jews, but they never talked about a state. They never came up with any precise formulations about what this should be. And clearly they were looking at the demographics of the area. And as I showed from those figures that we saw earlier on, there was a complete imbalance right the way through till 1948 between the two communities. The Jewish community, which only at its height in 1948 constituted about a third of the population of the whole area. So the British, when they came to look at after the Civil War, after the war and the uprising in 1936-39, they produced, and this was typical of the British, they set up commissions. They hadn't got an answer, so they went off and set up a commission which went through all this sort of evidence, and time and again they came back with a clear statement that actually what the Palestinians are fighting for is they're not fighting against the Jews, they're fighting against the British Empire. And it's a report after report that says this consistently, even including reports from the British military, who in some respects were quite honest in their appraisal of the situation, and some of them were kind of quite anti-the Zionists because they didn't like the way they operate, didn't approve of them. So Britain's kind of alliance with the Zionists was that it certainly tolerated the way in which the Yishuv was organized, the Jewish community, right from the outset of 1917 through. And Weizmann went to Palestine quite early and set up their own kind of structures, which were to do with education, were to do with health, were to do with employment, were to do with military and paramilitary organizations, some of which were legitimized by the British, like the Haganah and the Palestine Jewish police force. So what people are asking about, did the British authorize or endorse the emergence of the what I think you can rightly describe as terrorist organizations like the Irgun and the Stern Gang? That really came in the 1930s, much later. And yes, they did endorse it. Not only that, they trained some of them. Ord Wingate was a major in the British Army. He'd been operating in, I think he'd been in India or Burma, I can't remember quite which one of the two it was, and had operated violent, absolutely violent squads, military squads, whose job it was to go out and terrorize people, and as a course of that, terrorize villages. It's interesting because just recently there's been a panorama program which people may have seen about the operations of the SAS in Afghanistan, and that talked about the violence of these squads, British military, who went out in Afghanistan and killed people indiscriminately. They went and occupied houses and just killed people without any evidence of them having been attacking British forces or in any way associated with people who may have been attacking British forces. And that kind of thing was actually learnt and was schooled and came from a group that was called the Special Night Squad, which was set up by Wingate and was incorporated people who were part of the Haganah or part of the Irgun and the Stern Gang that went out doing this terrorizing. So they did things like if British forces were attacked in some place, they found the nearest village and they went in there and absolutely blew up houses with people in them. In some cases, they literally took all the men from that village in one or two instances and shot every 10th man of the village in the way in which the Romans conducted decimation, and that's where the word decimation comes from, the origin of that. And they conducted absolutely violent attacks. And going back to this SAS thing and the Afghanistan story, there was a British diplomat who was on the radio being interviewed about it, and he said that he was horrified by the way in which the SAS and the SBS and the Australians and the Americans were operating in Afghanistan. And he gave this, and he drew a direct comparison with Wingate and the way in which Wingate had conducted these actions, which were designed to terrorize people. In one case, they picked up, this is Wingate, they picked up 4 men outside a village, and Wingate sort of demanded of them to confess where the arms were being stored, and they didn't know, they didn't have any. So what he did was he stuffed one man's mouth with soil and kept pushing it down his throat and demanding to know. And this, you can imagine how that feels. And then just cold-bloodedly shot the man and shot the other 3 who had been with him. And this kind of terrorizing, this kind of methodology, it comes, of course, and I feel quite anxious to tell this story because I think it is an important story. These people learnt their tricks, of course. The British learnt these, the Israeli military that's operating now, in my view, learnt these things from the British. And the British had not only put them in operation in Palestine, but had also put them in operation before in Ireland during the War of Independence, when the Black and Tans carried out the most ruthless and vicious attacks on Irish people, doing the same thing, destroying houses where they suspected people of supporting the Republican movement, of blowing up houses and so on and so forth. And one of the interesting facts is that somewhere, and the figures vary in terms of estimates, but somewhere around about 7,000 of the Black and Tans were recruited to work in Palestine and were part of the British forces in Palestine. And so all of these things I'm talking about, that's how they learned them and that's where they came from. With regard to Saudi Arabia, yes, they did receive endorsement from the British and support. And of course, they took over areas that had been partly in the past part of the Hashemite sphere of influence and sphere of control, like Mecca and Medina, and absorbed them into Saudi Arabia, one of the few countries in the world that's actually named after a family. Although maybe Trump might change the name of America, we don't know. Call it Trumpland, perhaps. But yes, that is true. And the Saudis were, as it were, beholden to the British in terms of their positions.
I'll just perhaps add into that a couple of questions that I think relate. But Sammy's asked, what were the economic issues that made the British government decided to issue the Balfour Declaration, and perhaps moving forward through the past century, but to the sort of more towards the present day. But Anne Sophie's asked, what do you believe Britain's interests are now in being so deeply involved in the the current conflict and the situation in
Yeah.
Israel and Palestine?
I think very crudely, I mean, these two questions are obviously linked. I think very crudely, the answer is almost the same. And that is the Suez Canal, control over the Middle East area, and access to and control over the oil reserves that are in that region. Those were the things that drove Britain's economic interests in 1917. And again, I stress that these are not things that I'm reading back into the history. If you look at the cabinet papers and the discussions that they were having, they explicitly addressed these issues. In about 1912, the British Royal Navy, the military wing of the seafaring military, their ships were converted from coal-fired to oil-fired. And it made a big difference because it meant they had 50% more range in terms of the distances that they could travel. And the crewing of those ships, something like a quarter to a third of the people who were on those ships could be vastly reduced, because instead of people having to shovel coal into boilers, the fuel was piped, and this cut out a great deal of work. So it changed the nature. And then, of course, in the First World War itself, you saw the development of armored warfare. Tanks began to develop. You saw the development of the Royal Flying Corps, it was called, the precursor to the Royal Air Force. All of these things meant that the desire for oil and the need for oil increased and intensified. And this was foreseen in the discussions they had in the British cabinet. And this is what they were looking at in terms of trying to ensure that they had a friendly body in Palestine that was going to give them a bridgehead should they need to actually intervene, as we saw. Obviously, history demonstrates in 1956 when Gamal Abdel Nasser took over the Suez Canal, the British, went to war over that together with the French, supported by the Israelis. So those economic issues that were there, I think, were very evident, and I think in some respects they remain the same now. I don't have the time to show you a picture, but if you take a map of the area of Western Asia, as it more rightly should be called, we call it the Near East, but Central West Asia of the Arab world, and you look at where the oil fields are, and then you place on top of that a map of where the American military bases are and the American military naval bases are, you'll see that they're absolutely congruent, because America wants to ensure not only that it owns many of these oil fields, but that it can control the supply and the distribution and keep control over that. And I think that's, looking at the present day, that is what motivates the Americans. And I think now we have to say that in 1948, essentially, the Americans supplanted the British as the...
That's exactly what I was about to come on to, was to sort of say, obviously, Britain
Yeah,
was the powerful empire
yeah,
at the time of Balfour. Now the powerful empire is the US.
yeah,
How did the US assume the role as the kind of primary ally of Israel and sponsor of Israel? And how does its perhaps role differ from that of Britain, who kind of more largely preceded Israel's establishment? And when
yeah,
has that changeover kind of occurred, would you
yeah.
say?
I mean, the truth of the matter, if you look at the economic development of European countries and America, Britain was in competition with Germany principally, to some extent with France, but Britain and Germany were the kind of dominant economic forces in Europe in terms of their scale and their rate of development and their expansion. And America was actually overtaking them in the terms of the rate of development. Not, it hadn't achieved the same levels, but at the rate of development. So much so that Britain could not have fought, in my view, in the First World War without massive subventions from the United States of America in terms of food, to feed people, and in terms of loans which the British got. And if you look back at the cabinet papers, you'll find that the British were sensitive to America's views about things. When the Balfour Declaration was written, it was actually taken and shown to the Americans for approval before it was signed off. And I mentioned earlier on, I think, that the Americans at one stage were potential candidates to become the mandatory authority in the region to take over from the British and to supplant the British. So the Americans' interests in economic terms were not dissimilar to those of Britain, but a far more committed view in terms of the establishment of a Jewish state. And there's a famous declaration at Biltmore that took place in the early 1940s during the middle of the war, making that commitment of saying that there would be the endorsement of the creation of a Jewish state. And that you can see really just looking at and thinking about the way in which the British left Palestine in 1948. The British Empire was in collapse. India was about to become independent. Ireland finally left the Commonwealth in 1947, 1948. And they were not in a position to sustain their control over the empire as they had done in preceding years, and America became the substitute for that. There's an interesting anecdote which I do think is worth reflecting on, and I think needs some exploration, and that is the attitude of the Soviet Union. Because, of course, the Soviet Union initially saw Israel or saw the Zionist forces as potential allies because they were fighting British imperialism to create a Jewish state. And as such, from 1948 onwards, the Soviet Union, of course, voted for the creation of the State of Israel and endorsed it within a day of its being established, and endorsed the sending of arms through Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia to Israel, to the Zionist forces, to use, and also Messerschmitts and Spitfires, which were in Czechoslovakia, were sent to Palestine to be given to the Zionist forces. And I think that until the early 1950s, I strongly suspect that disorientated some people on the left, because the Soviet Union had been the great ally of Britain during the Second World War. It had rightly had a great deal of prestige because something like 2/3 of the Second World War were conducted on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union had suffered colossal damages in terms of people losing around about 20 million people. So there was a prestige attached to the Soviet Union. And I strongly suspect that this is what disorientated many people's thinking. So people like Nye Bevin and other people were actually pro-Zionists, as the majority, if not the overwhelming majority of the Labour Party, right the way through, as I said, back to as early as 1915, 1916. So that's an interesting part of the equation in terms of how America supplanted Britain as the principal ally. But I think it had the same components and constituents that motivated the British in the first place, were replicated in the kind of position of the Americans. And I'll stop at that point. But clearly, if you look at the Abraham Accords, you look at Trump's interventions in respect of what is happening, one can draw the lines between these. And another important part that I haven't talked about, sorry, Ben, another important part is the whole development of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. And maybe I'll stop at that point.
Oh, okay. I mean, I don't know if there's any more you want to say on the role of Trump, because I've got a couple more questions I want to get in before we wrap up. Which are a bit more looking at the relations of others, perhaps Britain's other former colonies, and the kind of role of the left in a sort of imperial states. But particularly on Trump and his outlook, I don't know if there's any more comments you want to make now. You've raised the Abraham Accords, but anything more detailed?
Yeah, I mean, Trump started on the Abraham Accords in his first period of office, and And it was, as people will know, an attempt to get the Arab states in particular to sign treaties of agreement between themselves and Israel, and importantly, America. And this was a strategy that really evolved. And again, it's something that's not really reflected on. Was spelt out in a document that was written in the mid-1990s by a group of American Jewish politicos like David Wurmser and Firth and Richard Pearl and people like that, who were part of the Bush administration, the Reagan administration, a document called A Clean Break, which was a strategy that they spelt out for Netanyahu for the elections, which was essentially saying that Israel should cease portraying itself as the victim in the situation, although we know, that reemerges as imagery that they continue to use, but that it should start acting as basically an authority in the region. And I think the Abraham Accords are ways that Trump is trying to tie the Arab world into a relationship with Israel, which is acting as essentially as the agent for the United States of America. I mean, I know some people will say that that Israel tells America what to do. I think that's completely and utterly wrong. If America decided to pull the rug and wasn't giving it $3.8 billion a year and billions of arms material, then I think Israel would be in a different position. But Israel, I think, does act as the agent of the United States. And I think what is happening is that America is trying to create a set of relationships using Israel as their arbiter on the ground. And Ronald Reagan said things like, if Israel wasn't there, we'd have to invent it. And other people made similar comments. And they want to do this in a similar way that Bush asserted in 2018 when he went to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And he said to people, the policies of the United States of America are based on the Monroe Doctrine. And just to explain, the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine formulated in the 1820s by the then president of the United States of America, which essentially said, all of the Western Hemisphere is under our control and don't you touch it. And they're still trying to do that in the Americas with the way in which they're operating. And I think that the Monroe Doctrine, if you like, is for the Western Hemisphere, and the Abraham Accords is for the Arab world. And very much Trump is trying to lock in the Arab peoples into a set of relationships mediated through Israel in order to keep control over those resources that are there. And we haven't got time to go into it, but they are vast resources. And it's tied in with, I think, in part, how Trump sees the competition and the challenge that China represents, because China's Belt and Road Initiative has not only a land passageway through to something like 28 stations across Europe, but it also has a Belt and Road maritime initiative through the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea to East Africa, and through the Suez Canal and up through the Arab Persian Gulf. And I think the US is anxious that there isn't a new set of economic and thereby political, social, cultural relationships developed by China with the Arab peoples of that region, which actually would kind of threaten their dominance, their hegemony in the area.
Thanks for that, Bernard. We're gonna run short of time, but I want to get in two quick questions, and then before I ask you to come back on those, I'm just going to get in a couple of remarks so that you're the one who's sort of wrapping up the meeting. But so something I wanted to come into was kind of the role of some of Britain's other former colonies. You already mentioned some of the British military activity in Palestine was informed by what it did in Ireland. I think you also said a lot of the British troops who were stationed in Palestine didn't include Indian forces, and I wonder if that's because of the rise of the self-determination movement in India being the dominant political force in that country. And I think it's interesting how currently, obviously, kind of right is in government in both India and in Ireland, but Ireland, there seems to be a huge amount of solidarity for Palestine, and India feels like the dominance of the right in politics is kind of controlling its relations with Israel. But also want to bring in South Africa, and I think it's worth you making some remarks on the experience of South Africa in relation to Palestine, and perhaps something on how the ANC, and Nelson Mandela, who are kind of lauded now, were how they were treated by the British and sort of Western establishment when they were seeking their liberation from apartheid. And then if I can just throw in one extra thing before we wrap up, I think we kind of see how in sort of imperial and colonial states, the left is often a weak political force. Certainly we are struggling in Britain. We've sort of seen a political setback for the left, but obviously a big growth in solidarity for Palestine. Obviously the left is weak in America. What is the state of we've had some questions come through from people watching about what's the state of the left in Israel, and is there any kind of pressure to end the genocide within Israel? So those are a couple of sort of broad questions from me there. I'm just going to do a quick sort of couple of wrap-up remarks if you just gather your thoughts, just to say, so that you can finish it. But I just wanted to say thank everyone for joining us today. Please do make a donation and keep Arise going. If you can, consider giving just £5 a month or becoming a friend of Arise. There should be some links appearing in the chat. We hope you've enjoyed this event and want to just remind you, I think Niamh mentioned it earlier, but we've got another event coming up on a totally different but very important subject on the disability welfare cuts being proposed by the government. We've got John McDonnell, Zara Sultana, Ellen Clifford from Disabled People Against Cuts, and Sarah Woolley coming to join us. That's an event on the 10th of June, and you should be able to register with an Eventbrite link in the chat as well, in the Q&A. I just finally want to urge people to get involved and support the work of both Labour in Palestine and also the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Do make sure you're active, make sure you're a member, and make sure you're getting along to their events. But that's sort of my concluding remarks. I'd just like to invite Bernard to come back on those last couple of points, kind of on the ex-colonial states and the solidarity they offer to the Palestinians and what we can learn, but also what's the state of the left in some of the countries that need to change how their governments are acting.
Yeah, I'll try and do justice to them, Ben. The point that you make about the reference to the non-Indian army being the army that was in Palestine, again, when I say these things, I can back them up by reference to discussions that took place within the cabinet. And they took a very conscious decision to try and minimize the number of Indian troops because large numbers of those Indian troops were Muslim. And they were fearful that giving the message that they were supporting the creation of a Jewish state or a Zionist state, a Jewish state, that would say that the holy places which were holy to Muslims might be in danger of being taken over, destroyed, whatever. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest place in Islam, and it is a place of pilgrimage. It's not only for prayer for people who live in and around Palestine, but for Muslims across the globe. So the actual exclusion of the Indians was a combination of that, a worry that the Muslim members of the army might defect and, as it were, join and support the Palestinians in resisting the immigration that was taking place. And also that it was, as you say, that there was the growth of the Indian independence movement, which began also at the end of the beginning of the 20th century and was growing apace in the early 1920s. And these things were real substantial. I mean, if you look at the documents of the cabinet when they were discussing, as I say, what to do about Palestine, they were actually talking about all sorts of things, which included Ireland, because the War of Independence in Ireland wasn't until 1920-21. But in 1916, of course, there was the uprising. And so there was a question of troops and how the British would try to manage that and whether they could respond to that. So this issue of the other Commonwealth areas. And there was also an anxiety in relation to America because of the Irish population in the United States. There were prisoners held in Britain who had been part of the 1916 Rising, and there was pressure to release these prisoners. I mean, we know, of course, some have been executed already, James Connolly and others, Porrick Pierce and so on. But there was, I think, about 500 who were imprisoned in Britain. And the cabinet has a discussion in the middle of the war, saying, should we release these? Because by releasing these, we'll gain some. I mean, it doesn't use this word, but this is essentially what they're saying. We'll gain some favor with the Americans, and we want to get loans off them in order to be able to continue to conduct the war. So they're weighing up the implications of all of these sorts of things. And so, Ireland, which was at that time still part of the empire, was one of the zones that they were thinking about, and they were sensitive about what was happening in India and so on. So very much so, but that remains an issue. In terms of South Africa and the South African struggle for independence, I mean, that is a long discussion, but clearly what one has to say about South Africa, and this is without making any or wanting to be in any way judgmental about Palestine, but there was a unified leadership, there was a centralized leadership, there was a coordination between the different components of the United Democratic Front and the trade union movement, the political parties like the Communist Party. There was a serious coalition of political leadership in which those leaders were known and identified. And there was a unity around that project, which clearly gave it an authority when it was going out to the world, calling for boycotts and calling for action and solidarity support across the globe. It spoke with that authority of representing a unified leadership. And also, I think it would be true to say that this is a separate discussion, but I just make it as a comment. In terms of the kind of way in which the struggles were conducted, they were through mass action in South Africa, and the military actions that were taken perfectly legitimately, in my view, as indeed the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, but nevertheless were taken with a view to attacking economic targets and opening up the contradictions that were there as a result of apartheid because of the exclusion of the black majority. And of course, in South Africa also, one has to say, a quite different demographic balance of forces and a quite different situation. In Israel, the Israelis don't want the Palestinians, they don't want them there, and they think that their economy can function without them. They have workers coming in, but it's not the same situation where in South Africa, essentially the white minority ruling class needed black workers. It needed the black workers, and the economy couldn't function without it. So there's a different sort of dynamic that's there. In terms of the opposition in other countries, I mean, just as an aside, I think it was interesting during the World Cup, you saw the masses of people in the crowd, the Arab peoples who were attending those football matches, and you still see it now in places like Casablanca and Morocco and other places where the government has got friendly relations with Israel or has signed the Abraham Accords. Some of the football teams like Raja Casablanca, they have massive tifos and they're singing songs in support of the Palestinians, much like Glasgow Celtic supporters are. So I think amongst the Arab masses, there is a real potential for support. And I think this is occasionally one of the reasons why Trump and the Americans get a bit anxious, because if, as it were, the Arab peoples across the area came out in revolt, as in the 2011-2012 Arab Springs, they could overthrow these regimes, these hierarchy, these oligarchs that are running the various countries in Saudi Arabia and in Jordan and other parts of that region in an extremely dramatic way. And that would have a massive impact, because I've said this on many occasions, but I believe it to be true, that the Palestinians if they were given the right to establish a state, it would be a very democratic state. It would be a state that would be very advanced in many respects, because Palestine has the highest literacy rate in the region. It has a very educated and very sophisticated society. So I think the Americans, and some of the times why I think Trump kind of oscillates in his attitude towards the Israelis, and some of the Americans oscillate, is because they recognize that behind these oligarchic dictators, there stands the Arab masses who, if they chose and were able to and formulated an alternative and overthrew them, would change the whole complexion of the politics and the dynamics of the region. As far as Israel goes, sadly, I think one has to say that the left and the opposition to Netanyahu and the current government is very, very small. It's there, it is there, and it is courageous, and there are people who are making a stand. Not all of them, if you like, with the same immediate perspectives, but their sentiment is that they're critical. So you have people like beyond the breaking the silence, the soldiers who most of whom served in Hebron, and who came out, and Jenin and other cities in the West Bank, and have come out critical of the way in which the Israeli military operate. You've got the refuseniks, the young people, extremely courageous, because military service is compulsory in Israel. If you don't do military service, you have to do some kind of social service. And there are young people who are refusing to serve and to be part of that. There are groups of people like ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, who are campaigning against the evictions that are taking place of Palestinians in places like Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem and so on. So there are people, and I think personally, I think it's important to express our solidarity with them, however limited. Nevertheless, it's a kind of courageous stand that they're making. And I sense among some sections, but not all, of the families of the hostages, there is also an alienation with Netanyahu, and a kind of revulsion at his dogmatism, his intransigence, and his brutal operation of military operation that he's conducting. Having said that, there are also some of those families who basically say, well, get the hostages out and then go in and kill everybody. So I don't want to exaggerate that scenario, but I think what it does foreshadow is that there are differences within Israeli society. They're nowhere like the magnitude of the differences that emerged in 1981-82 around Lebanon that I was talking about earlier, when 500,000 people were on the streets. But I think that nevertheless, we should solidarize with them, as well as obviously our principal solidarity being with the Palestinian people in this moment of facing what is a horrendous assault, the most brutal genocide that is being conducted, one which the Labour government should be outrightly condemning, should be offering support to the Palestinians, should be refusing to allow Akrotiri in Cyprus to be used as a base from which planes are sent to bomb Gaza. It should be ensuring that there is a commitment and making a demand that Israel makes complete and absolute reparations for all of the damage that they've done, that every single Palestinian who comes from Gaza and wants to return to Gaza has that entitlement, and that their homes and businesses and society is rebuilt. And Britain is complicit, and as complicit should pay those reparations too. And I think, that the position of the British government, the position of the Foreign Secretary, the response to the judgments that have been made by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court are absolutely woeful. And I hope that people who are active in the Labour Party will join with Arise and with other comrades who are active to try to ensure that the resolution goes to this year's annual conference that clearly calls for an end to Britain's complicity in the bombings and the killings that are taking place, and gives complete solidarity to the Palestinians in their aspirations for the right to self-determination. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that, Bernard. And on that point, I think it's worth us flagging. We've got Parliament's in recess this week, but we can still see the appalling events of how the Israelis are trying to politicize the distribution of aid and make it fit in with their military aims. And at the same time as the government has said it's pausing trade negotiations, we're still seeing a trade envoy going out in the form of Ian Austin, the member of the House of Lords, and really celebrating Britain's relationship with Israel, and that really needs to be stopped. So I believe there is a PSC demo at Parliament next Wednesday called Red Lines for Palestine. So I will flag that to everyone, and go and have a look on the PSC social media accounts or website, and you'll find out the details of when that is. And just to say thanks again to Bernard for joining us, and do look up his book, The Balfour Declaration, Empire, Mandate and Resistance in Palestine, to read more about the kind of things he's been discussing tonight, and I hope we'll have another discussion like this in the near future. So thanks again, Bernard.
Thank you.